Good evening. I'm Mark Meister, the Executive Director of the Museum of Russian Art, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to tonight's program, Journeys Through the Russian Empire, a virtual discussion with author William Brumfield. Before we get started, I would like to remind everyone that the museum is open 7 days a week, and there is now a free cell phone audio tour of our major exhibition, Leaders in the Masses, Mega Paintings from Soviet Ukraine. Our fantastic museum shop is also open, and you will find Professor Brumfield's book there. Finally, for those of you who are museum members, thanks as always for your support. For those of you who aren't members, I urge you to join and enjoy free admission to the museum, as well as a discount at the museum shop. And now I give you the museum's curator, Masha Zavialova, to introduce tonight's guest.
Hello, everyone. It is my pleasure today to introduce to you all our esteemed guest, Professor William Bramfield. William is a professor of Slavic studies at Tulane University, but what is he is more known for, he is the foremost authority on Russian architecture in the West. William is the author, editor, and photographer of numerous books on Russian architecture, including Architecture at the End of the Earth and Lost Russia, and many more. He is also a member of the State Russian Academy of Architecture and Construction Sciences and the Russian Academy of Fine Arts. And recently, just last year, William got the most important Russian award given to foreigners, non-Russian citizens. This is the Order of Friendship awarded to William in 2019. His photography collections can be found in the Library of Congress and in the National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C. And as far as our museum, William's connection to our museum goes back to 2008, when I just approached him, I believe, to get some of his photographs of Russian churches for our photography, for our exhibition of Russian icons from Yaroslav. Since then, we had 2 solo exhibitions of William photography, the Imperial St. Petersburg and the photographs of the Russian North. And William was kind enough to donate some of his photography prints, some of the objects of folk art that he brought from Russia, from the Russian North, and also his wonderful digital collection of Kargopol photography of thousands of images to our museum. And we are very grateful to William for that. But I've known William for many years, and I know him, among other things, as the best non-native speaker of the Russian language that I ever met. His command of Russian is amazing. And I know from experience that to learn the language to this extent, you need to have a need. So it's not just, you can't learn a language that well for pleasure, or even if you have a passion for the language, you have to have a need. And William's need in the Russian language is connected to his project of an entire lifetime of work on Russian architecture. I don't know how many times William traveled to Russia. Let's ask him. William.
That's a question I should know, but for the past decade, if not more, I've spent approximately half of every year in Russia. Sometimes I make 5, 6, even 7 trips a year to Russia for field work, and also work with my publisher and work with colleagues. So how many trips have I made? I should count it up at some point, but I imagine it's been over 100 since, but we're talking about 50 years since my first trip, 50 years.
Mm-hmm. So William, why Russian architecture? because, you know, it's what's behind it all. Why Russian architecture, of the many things that you could contribute your gifts and talent and passion and energy to.
Well, it starts with Russian literature, my fascination with that, which began in my teen years when I began to read Russian novels, which had such a resonance for my understanding of the world. I grew up in the American South at a very complicated time. These issues are still with us, as we know, about social justice. And in the 1950s, it seems that we have settled problems on one level and they come back to haunt us. And I think growing up in that context gave me a bridge to Russia's novels, which also grapple with these issues of social justice, particularly the work of Tolstoy and Dostoevsky. It all began with Tolstoy. So it's the literature that begins it all, the insight into Russia. And that prepared me for my first trip to Russia. I was already a graduate student at the University of California, Berkeley, in my fourth year of graduate studies. And it was almost, when I look back over it, the entire experience, it seems little short of miraculous. That first trip in the summer of 1970, exchange of language teachers. At that point, I was a graduate student. I still didn't teach language. And yet they didn't have enough of people applying applying to go on that program. Back in those days, you really had to go on an official program. You couldn't just go to Russia. So my faculty advisor said, "Do you want to go? There's an extra space." So the whole thing seems to have been little short of miraculous. There's a door opened here, walk through it. And therefore, when I got to Russia on that first day, I remember it as though it were yesterday. The birch trees, you could still see them coming in from Sheremetyevo airport. They had me from the first minute. Russia had me from the first minute. And I had my little camera that I had bought for this trip, never owned a camera before. Did research, what's a good light camera, and I made a good choice. It was compact, had a good lens, a Konica C135. You could put it in your pocket, and yet it took full frame photographs. And when I came back at the end of that summer of 1970 and looked at the photographs, it was a revelation. I had no idea, A, that I could do that, and B, that those images would be so powerful. And they focused on the architecture. Now, this architecture has been in my background. I've had relatives who were architects. My experience in New Orleans showed me the importance of an architectural environment. Many American cities lack that environment, but New Orleans had it. So I was prepared to visualize urban space as a reflection of a people, who they are, what their culture is. So I was prepared in that sense. But what I didn't expect was the power of the photographs that I took on that first trip. And that was confirmed when I showed them to colleagues at Berkeley that this is something extraordinary. So I immediately applied to go back. I went back as a dissertation fellow in 71, 72, and I was working on a dissertation, but the little secret was I really wanted to go back and just see in every sense of the word, see that culture, see the people, see the cities, St. Petersburg above all at that time, and record it with my little camera and all my rolls of film, which I could send out to be developed through the embassy pouch. So it happened very quickly. And this, I suppose, is the concept of epiphany, that revelation that there is something that you need to do. And how you're going to do it, where it's going to take you, you don't know, but you just keep going through the doors that open. And that's what my experience at Russia was. I could go on in more detail about that, and about the work for my first book, which also almost didn't happen to my colleagues. My scholarly colleagues didn't understand suddenly this fascination with photography and Russian architecture. But I see Russian culture as a whole, that literature and art and architecture, they're an expression of a great culture, a great country, a very complex country, a country with a very tragic and turbulent history. But that is all a part of history. And my work at Berkeley also included a very strong component of Russian history. Berkeley was very tolerant of these parallel interests. So it wasn't just literature, it was history, it was the arts, it was the visual component. And I felt that at home in Russia, pursuing all of these various strands in the Russian experience and in Russian culture. I just felt, don't shut anything off, be open to it all. And
it's very fascinating to me because quite often, I lived in the Soviet, I was born in the Soviet Union. I came to the US in 2001. So I lived through the late Soviet Union and the collapse of the Soviet Union. And I know that quite often people traveled to the Soviet Union, and that's what they saw. They saw, the totalitarian country and the socialist regime. And you managed to see something else, the beauty of art and culture and history, and not focusing on the Sovietness.
Yeah.
Which and it proved you right, because the Soviet Union is gone. Russian art and culture and architecture are still there.
Absolutely.
So what do you remember, like, from your travels to Russia in the 70s when it was still the Soviet Union?
Well, the ability in language is so important here, and the language did not come easily to me, but the Russians are tolerant and patient. It's the meetings with people, and you understood even from that first year. Yes, there were certain people who conformed to a stereotype at the university of the bureaucrat, but there were other people who, I mean, and remember, it's a very complicated time. It was the height of the Vietnam War. It was a really very dangerous political situation at that time. We had been bombing North Vietnam. There were some very, very serious clouds over our relations between the United States and the Soviet Union. And yet the people I met there was such a warmth, a genuineness of spirit. It wasn't feigned. They were interested in us, and I was interested in what they represented. And it just never stops. Once you start that dialogue, you discover so much about people, and that lifts your own knowledge of yourself. You find out something about yourself by interacting with other people. And that's what Russia did for me immediately. There was never any hesitation from the very beginning. Coming in contact with, relating, talking with people, and being open to what you see around you.
Yeah, thank you. On behalf of the Russians, as a Russian person, I really very much appreciate your genuine interest in not just the political weirdness of the Soviet period, but in some of the things that never passed, the beauty of the national psyche and the wonderful art and culture of Russia.
Yeah, and I remember I'll say one telling incident when I was doing a dissertation work there in 79, 80. No, excuse me, 71, 72. The years do tend to blend. But anyway, there was, we had roommates who were Soviets, and they were supposed to they were chosen because they were members of the Komsomol or whatnot. And there would be times when we would get into arguments about ideology and so forth. But basically, and then there would be a moment that one of them had a friend coming in, also a party activist from the provinces. He walked in the door in the little dormitory room, and he had a briefcase. And out of the briefcase, he took a jar with this very transparent liquid. It was my first introduction to samagon. The Russian version of homemade vodka. So that's when all of the pretense falls away, and you get a sense that people want to relate. And in Russia, as you know, sometimes that the lubricant for that relationship can be a little rюмочка, a little glass of high quality liquid, shall we call it. And so that notion that there is the official facade and then there is the personal, who's behind that. And it's just, there were so many experiences like that in Russia. I could say a little bit more about my encounters with that liquid, but perhaps we can go on to other topics at the moment.
Yes, yeah, I would like now to probably move closer to the wonderful book that you published recently on the photographic legacy of Prokudin-Gorsky. In our museum, we had 2 exhibitions of Prokudin-Gorsky photography, and both of them were extremely popular. Prokudin-Gorsky is becoming more well-known in the West. He is really a very well-known photographer and the early pioneer of color photography in Russia. Could you tell us more about him?
Well, again, it's sort of this remarkable Russian story. He was born in Vladimir province in 1869 on an estate. He was of the sort of middle level nobility, very good education, was fascinated with chemistry. Went to St. Petersburg and studied there and became interested in color photography, the theory behind color photography. Everybody was trying to find out a method. Photography was already a century old almost. But color photography remained an elusive goal. And so he began to acquaint himself with techniques for rendering a color image that had been developed in Germany. And he managed to devise a camera of his own that would make that miracle possible. It was a very cumbersome process. And it proved to be not the direction that color photography would eventually take, which was emulsions on a layer of celluloid. But it was a method that still works today for printing photographs. You break them up into 3 primary colors. So he had a glass plate. I think we have an image of it later on. We'll show it when we start advancing the slides. That would drop down in a box camera 3 times, each time with a different color filter, and would produce the images, the cyan, the yellow, and the magenta or red that would be combined into a color process. And he used that to those images to project on a screen. He had a projector that would recombine them for a image that he could show people. And he was fascinated by this, not just as an invention, but as a way to show Russia in all of its diversity and historical depth. So he began in 1903. His first photographs that we know of were taken, his trips around the Petersburg area. And eventually he went farther afield, and his work came to the attention of Nicholas II in 1909. He had an audience with the Tsar. The Tsar gave his blessing. He never worked for Nicholas. He was not a court photographer. That's a myth. But Nicholas paved the way for Prokudin-Gorsky to get permission, and he paved the way for the Ministry of Transportation in Russia to provide logistical support. In other words, support by river and by rail. So he really pursued 2 paths. One, documenting bridges, canals, railroad bridges, things that even today have fascinating interest just from a technical point of view, history of Russian engineering. And along with that, he would photograph the monasteries, the houses, the people that he encountered on the way, and even went into Central Asia, part of the Russian Empire that had been absorbed in the 1870s. Turkestan was what it was called then. So and then he would bring these images back and he would project them for public audiences. He also had a business. He wanted to print them in color handbooks, guidebooks, for example. But the main thing, and to this day, it remains something of a mystery. Again, another miracle. His passion, his drive to photograph as much of Russia as he could. He went to the Caucasus. How he did it all, I don't understand. But he followed, in many cases, the railroads. Russia's rail network was expanding very rapidly at that time. So that by pursuing modern technology, he could record Russia's past. That's something of a paradox, isn't it? He photographs all of these monasteries and cathedrals and far-flung areas of Russia, and not just monuments of architecture, but also people at work, and so forth. And he really saw a traditional society. You bring that out. That's one of the things people love about Prokudin-Gorsky. Oh, it looks timeless. It looks pre-modern. And yet, in order to get those photographs, he had to make use of modern advances in transportation technology, modern advances in photography. So it's like Russia at the beginning of the 20th century. It was sort of a bundle of, what would you say, contradictions, modernity and the past. And as we know, that those contradictions would later explode in a massive cataclysm. And Prokudin-Gorsky left Russia in 1918, the summer after, shortly after the murder of Tsar Nicholas and his family in July of 1918. He wasn't anti-Soviet, but at that point, it became obvious to him that he would really have very little chance of a normal life in the Soviet Union. So he went out in 1918 and eventually settled in France, kept up his business, brought his family out eventually, and even wanted to get into the movie business in the south of France. So he was experimenting with that. He persevered. He never lost a sense of hope. That's the only thing I can say about it. And his collection, we're not sure how, his collection of glass plates, negatives, eventually made their way out. And after he died in near Paris, right after the liberation, September, I think it was the 27th, 1944, and his heirs, by his second marriage, if I'm not mistaken, decided to sell the photograph to a representative of the Library of Congress in 1948. You couldn't make this stuff up. It's so improbable. And then the collection made its way to the Library of Congress. There was a book by Robert Allshouse, a photographer for the Tsar, or something like that. I might not have the title correct, but and it first gave people an indication of the remarkable quality of his color work. Where is this coming from? Russia, beginning of the 20th century, in color, not colorized, but in color. And then the Library of Congress in 1985 invited me to arrange, because I was a photographer and an architectural historian, I already had a big book on Russian architecture, Gold and Azure, 1,000 Years of Russian Architecture. He said, come and work with this collection, do an exhibit for us. And when I began to leaf through the albums that Prokudin-Gorsky had made of little contact prints from each one of his negatives, so that you could identify them, I mean, I was just the shock of discovery. I'd been to these places. I'd even been to Central Asia. I'd seen the things that he saw. I understood the logic of what he was doing. And at that point, Prokudin-Gorsky's work and my project in Russia pursued their parallel paths. But it's miraculous. It's so much in one's experience of Russia tends to be. It's just, how could this happen? But it happened.
Yeah, and the wonderful result of that is this beautiful 400-page book. Now,
520-page book.
Yeah.
400 color photographs, but 520 pages. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Let's now look, I would like to share my screen, and let's now look at some of the photographs from the book.
Fine.
And then we can talk about the book and what you photographed there.
Okay. People sometimes ask, do I deliberately reproduce Prokudin-Gorsky's views? Very rarely do I do that. But there is a logic of approaching a structure, and sometimes he and I follow the same logic. Sometimes we do it in a different way. And I have a very different camera from the one that he used. I have much more flexibility. His camera had to be very steady, and it had to be in a level place, and it couldn't be tilted because otherwise the negative would not drop down. All right, there he is on a stream in the Caucasus, background. And this photograph was taken around 1911. All of the dates are in the captions. I don't always remember them right off the top of my head, but there he is sitting by a screen. And it's not really an auto portrait. His son or his assistant, often it would be his son, is there working the camera. Because remember, you have to have 3 exposures. Every photograph has 3 exposures. You see the edges of the photograph there? You see the magenta and you see the cyan and the yellow. Those are 3 exposures. So somebody has to change the filter each time the negative drops down in order to record that photograph. So there someone is photographing him with his camera. There he's sitting with his cane by a stream in the Caucasus. All of the information is given in the captions to the book, and it gives a sense of, you see the distance, the Caucasus, snow-covered mountains there in the distance. Just an idea of the empire. This place is now a different country. It's called Georgia. It's no longer a part of Russia. But when he was photographing, it seemed to be this vast empire, which was, as we now know, already on the brink of cataclysm.
Yeah, and the quality of these photographs is amazing. Can you talk a little bit about what happened to these glass negatives in the Library of Congress? Because now we can look at them on the screen, and the Library of Congress actually provides open access to these.
That's right.
To these photographs. That's how we could be able, we were able to do 2 exhibitions just downloading from the Library of Congress website.
Yes, high resolution images. Yes, but when the Library of Congress, of course, many of the glass negatives were lost or broken. Some of them were damaged. That's why the album of contact prints that he made, some 13 albums, 2,000 or so images, they're now invaluable because even if we don't have the original glass negative, which is quite large, by the way, we at least have a contact print from the magenta spectrum, which gave most of the information that you needed on the original photograph. We'll talk about this. We'll show some examples later on. But the glass negatives were fragile. They were heavy. And there was loss. We don't know, perhaps when the collection was shipped out of the Soviet Union, whenever it was shipped out, and the people might have taken some of the images. We just don't know many things about this process, but it was a very cumbersome and heavy set of images. Each one of those glass plates would probably weigh a pound. Or so. But that large image gives you the detail that you're talking about. You just have to line up the 3 images. It's called registration, and you get them right. It's the same process that any printer would know today, who uses the standard offset method of printing. You combine the 3 colors, the 3 basic colors. It's so-called subtractive system. Yellow, blue, and red. The light rays are red, green, and violet blue. That's the additive system. But when you actually already have the image on a surface, it's called a subtractive, and you combine the 3 colors. And that's what you're seeing right here. You're seeing the blue, the red, the yellow. You put them all together, and you get a color image. That's the way color photographs are printed on paper even to this day in publishing. houses.
So in the early 2000s, the Library of Congress digitized
Yeah.
all of these images.
Yeah, what they had to do is the first thing they did, and this was done much earlier, I think in the 1970s, they had to make copies of the glass negatives. And that was fairly easy to do. You just made a copy, a contact copy on film, and those film copies were the ones that people used. The glass negatives were far too fragile to be reproduced in any other way. So you had those, and then you had the images. You could scan those copy negatives, and at that point, the decision was made after much deliberation to the Library of Congress is a very complex institution. The technology was being developed so that those images could be digitized and recorded electronically. The three parts of the negative could be combined. All of this is scrupulously preserved in the Library of Congress. And as you said, it is open to the public. You open the image and each one will show you the color final product, but it will also show you the three-part negative. Just open the Library of Congress site and go to the Prokudin-Gorsky collection. Every one of them will be there.
Yeah, that's wonderful. So now let's just follow the journeys of Prokudin-Gorsky and William Bramfield and look at some of the sites that both of them visited.
All right.
This is
Well,
William,
here I am
actually.
on the remnants of a medieval fortress outside of Samarkand in May of 1972.
So
Yeah.
just the beginning of your journees to Russia.
That's right. And it was arranged by Leningrad. Let's go back to that photograph if we can, that Central Asian photograph, if we can get back to it. There, all of my, again, we're on the official exchange. We were working on dissertations, my American friends in Leningrad, at Leningrad University. And at the end of the year, the foreign department, the INATDEL as it was called, said, we'll arrange a trip to Central Asia. Everybody else was busy trying to complete their scholarly work in the libraries. After all, their livelihood, their dissertations depended on this. I had already finished my goals, and I said, well, sure, I'll go on this trip. I was the only American who went. And to this day, I can't understand how you would not go on a trip to the fabled cities of Samarkand and Bukhara. And there he was in this little international group. There were about 10 of us. And one of them is photographing me here in the ruins of this medieval fortress outside of Samarkand in Central Asia. Now it's Uzbekistan, the Republic of Uzbekistan. And this was long before I knew anything about Prokudin-Gorsky. When I heard about Prokudin-Gorsky and I saw that he had been there, again, you couldn't think this up. It's mystical, as the Russians say, it's fate. So we can go on to some other aspects of the journey. Here is the Dormition Cathedral, one of the most important in all of Russia, in the ancient city of Vladimir. This is Prokudin-Gorsky's photograph on the left. And there's my photograph over on the right, taken in March 1972. In that year, I was a dissertation year at Leningrad, but we were also able to tour the cities of ancient Russian culture, such as Vladimir, to the northeast of Moscow. And you can see I take pretty much the same perspective that Prokudin-Gorsky does. The trees have grown a little bit in that ravine in the front, but otherwise he and I found, without knowing each other's work, he and I found the same perspective. So that's an example when I don't really reproduce his work. It's just the logic that's there. What he chose to photograph and what I chose to photograph, about the same time of day, by the way. You can see that by the sunlight on the cupolas, on the buildings. I have a different lens. It takes in a little bit more space. And he is working in the summer. He rarely worked in the winter for various technical reasons. But other than that, there is his photograph from 1911, I believe, and my photograph from 1970. That's 72. That's a 60-year difference. That's about as close as his work gets to mine, 6 decades.
Yeah, it's amazing that you chose the same perspective without even knowing of his work at that time.
But there's a logic. If you're serious about recording architecture and you know how to do it, that is the position you're going to take to get that east view of the cathedral. So both he and I understood, yeah, the eye tells you, Masha, the eye tells you what to do. Where's your center of gravity? That's what you've got to figure out when you're approaching one of these monuments with a lens. How are you going to record it? First, you have to determine your center of gravity. He did that. I did it. The logic in both cases is the same.
Yeah, but probably you have the same sense of geometry as he did.
That's
because,
what I'm saying.
Different photographers could approach it.
Of course.
differently.
And this is not the only view. I have much more flexibility with my cameras than he did, so that I could take a more dynamic approach. But there are certain cases where there's just, the situation tells you what to do.
Mhm. Okay, let's move to the next slide.
And these are all page spreads from the book. In other words, these are images that in the book are presented opposite each other, so that you have, the book is beautifully designed. You have the integration of his image and my image and the text surrounding it. All of that is presented very logically in terms of its page. And of course, the pages are huge. It's an unusually large format book, as you know. So that gives the photographs room to breathe, as it were. Here is the Nativity Cathedral in Suzdal, originally built in the 12th century. My photograph over there on the left, and his photograph taken again around 1910. The precise dates are always in the captions. I believe that a photograph is a time machine, but it works only if you know the date when it was photographed. And I've always been fortunate, even before I knew where my project would take me, to date the photographs. I have a log, field log, of every image that I've taken in Russia, which now over 150,000. So that I can tell you what the year is. And you can see over on the left, the cathedral there has this curved roof line at the top. That's the original roof line that was restored after the Second World War. Prokudin-Gorsky's photograph, if you can see it, I mean, it seems to be blocked in my screen, but it shows a level roof line that was often modified in the 18th century because it was just easier to maintain. So comparing his photograph and my photograph will show differences in the preservation of an ancient historical cultural monument. You see the top of the cathedral in my photograph and the top of the photograph in the Prokudin-Gorsky's rendering, they're different.
Yeah.
And I try to explain that in the book.
I can see that. And, when I look at the images that you took and compare them to Prokudin-Gorsky as photography, what strikes me is that sometimes you look at these photographs and they're sometimes 100 years apart.
Right.
And it's as if nothing happened. Sometimes it seems like time has frozen, and we see the same, surroundings, the same kind of lawns. But some other photographs are so revealing of this very difficult century that Russia had to go through.
My photographs show how much you're still there. Again, you look at the difference in the roof line. Over on the left, Prokudin-Gorsky's photograph, and mine over on the right, taken in 1988. You can see the, I don't know whether you can follow the arrow that I'm moving over the screen. But you can see again how they restored it. There was this emphasis after the Second World War. It became fashionable to be proud of Russian culture, specifically Russian culture. So the things that they had ignored before the war, and now suddenly became objects of state priority. You see, this is when they were rebuilding the palaces that had been destroyed outside of Leningrad, St. Petersburg. You remember that?
Yeah, those restoration works were based on very thorough research of the archives. They would go back to
Sure.
original designs and study all the alterations that were
That's right.
done to buildings through the centuries. And
Yes,
Yeah.
and that's the palaces, imperial palaces. But the same logic applied to medieval Russian monuments. They said, what did this really look like when it was first built? So they would go back and restore the roof line on the basis of study of documents and fragments of masonry and so forth, so that you see the results of that in my photographs. All right, now here, yeah, if we go to the next one that you, all right, yeah, okay, the next, yeah. This is a fascinating interior. It's interior of the Dormition Cathedral at the center of Smolensk. Smolensk, which was fought over and largely destroyed in the Napoleonic invasion. Tolstoy describes it very graphically, the battle for Smolensk and the death of a small child from the artillery fire. And yet this cathedral on the top of the main hill in Smolensk survived, and it survived all of the fighting during the Second World War around Smolensk. Terrible fighting. Hundreds of thousands of people died on both sides in battles around Smolensk, both in 1941 and again in 1943 when the Red Army retook the city. That's cathedral survived. Now, in that icon setting over on the left by Prokudin-Gorsky, you see one of the most sacred icons in all of Russia, the Smolensk Mother of God, or the Hadajetria Mother of God. Is reputed to have been painted by St. Luke himself. All right, now my photograph with a larger lens over on the right shows you all of the glory of the interior of this Baroque interior. And over on the right is the place where the icon would have been kept. Except after the Second World War, guess what? The icon was gone. We don't know to this day where it is. So I found another Hadajetria icon in Smolensk and placed it in the same place that you see in my photograph and in Prokudin-Gorsky's photograph. All of that was preserved. We seem to be going back. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So that's
this cathedral was probably the first church that I've been to. It was, I believe, it should be late 1960s. And we were passing through Smolensk, and my parents they took me there to see the interior. They were atheists. And to this day, I remember what I see now on both of these photographs. That was the first Russian Orthodox church that was active, that was not a museum. I've been to plenty of museums that were former churches in my childhood, but that was the only active church at that time that I visited. And I still remember there was a wedding here. A seminary student, a future priest, was getting married. And I was so impressed with the overall, the sumptuousness and the ritual.
That's very interesting comment. And we have a question on the screen that I'll try to answer in just a minute about the icon. But this notion that, Russians and many Russians have lived in such the majority of Russians lived in very humble dwellings, to put it modestly. And yet they could go into these temples and it would be like they would be transposed to another world. And that feeling that you described is very much a part of Russian culture, of entering that space, that sacred space. Later, the Soviets tried to recreate that, for example, in the Moscow metro. You would go into these palaces that were underground. You may live in a shabby place, but you could go into and be amazed by the artistry of this public space. Well, churches also were public spaces in that sense. Maybe that's one reason why many of them were preserved in the Soviet period. Now, I saw a question on the screen. Where is the icon in the photograph on the left? You see it there under, that's it right there. And the icons in those days, and Masha, I'm sure perhaps you have examples in the museum, were often covered, except for the face and the hands of the saint, were often covered in elaborate silver overlays. that's something that probably you've explained to your people there. So what you're seeing most of there is a silver overlay of the icon.
Yeah, but you can see the face of
That's
the
right.
Mother of God,
And the
and
hand,
this is Jesus,
and the Christ child. Yeah, that's right.
the Christ child right here.
That's right. That's right.
Okay, let's move.
Now, this is another fascinating story. This is the monument to the Battle of Borodino in the late August 1812, outside of Moscow, one of the major events, if not the major event of the War of 1812. A huge battle, hundreds of thousands of French and their allies on one side and Russians on the other side. Tolstoy describes that as one of the most vivid passages in all of Russian literature. And here was one of the pivotal points, the Bagration fortification, named after the Georgian general who commanded a part of the Russian field army at that battle, Prince Bagration. 1930-31, at the height of a communist assault on old Russia, they tore down in Moscow, you know, the Cathedral of Christ the Redeemer, which was later rebuilt, just tore it down. And it was a monument to the War of 1812, Russian sacrifices. Well, here is another monument to one of the most desperate parts of the struggle. Tens of thousands of people died around this fortification as the French charged it and the Russians tried to retake it. People firing at each other point blank. So they erected this monument, and I believe it was in 1839, to commemorate this point. And then in 1931, 30-31, the Soviets came in and blew it up. They just blew it up. And underneath it was actually the grave of Prince Bagration, the marshal who had kept the Russians in the field. It did so much. It was a hero. They blew his grave up. And the Soviet Union, after the Second World War, they became ashamed of these things, but not really until the collapse of the Soviet Union was there really a concerted effort to recreate this. They gathered fragments, if you can imagine this, of his body and his uniform that had survived the blast and decided to recreate the monument itself. My photograph over there shows its recreation right before the 200th anniversary, 2012, right? 2012, you can still see them working at the bottom of the recreation. You can see the icon there on the side of the recreation. And between Prokudin-Gorsky's photographs and my photographs is an entire turbulent century, the long 20th century in Russia. And I say in the conclusion to the book that we need to keep this in mind when we look at Prokudin-Gorsky's photographs, how beautiful they are, how much they seem to go with Russian history, traditional Russian history, and yet they're in the 20th century. And they shared all of the turbulence of the 20th century. And these photographs, which you chose, by the way, show right there. Over on the right is a reconstruction of something that the Soviets blew up at the beginning of the 1930s when they wanted to attack every notion of imperial Russian past.
Yeah, so, and Napoleon was on this field at that time, right?
Yes. And it was a shock. He never recovered. He did get to Moscow. The Russians had to withdraw, but they withdrew in good order. Field Marshal Kutuzov kept the army together, and eventually they drove Napoleon out, but not without terrible sacrifice and the burning of Moscow, as you know. Napoleon thought that Alexander I would sue for peace. He did. All of that encapsulated in these stories. But Masha, what did I say at the beginning? Russian literature is a part of the picture. Didn't I tell you that? Russian literature.
Yeah,
It's a part
I know that very well.
Yeah. I wish some colleagues understood it a little bit better. Anyway, over here, you find sort of a remarkable exercise in Gothic revival architecture. Catherine the Great loved it, and one of her architects, Matvey Kazakov, specialized in it. So here's an ancient monastery on the outskirts of the city of Kolomna to the south of Moscow. And you see these fantastical towers arising of the corners of the monastery walls. I go up a little bit closer and show you one of that's Russia. Nowhere else but in Russia would you see this. This sense of architecture as fantasy. They were built in the late in the 18th century. Now, this is Prokudin-Gorsky's photograph of the church Ankimova near Vytegra and on the Russian north. The cruise ships from Moscow to Petersburg. I know many of your people have probably taken that cruise. They go right past this site. It's one of the great wooden churches of 18th century Russia. And guess what? In 1960, some people, we would call them homeless, got in there and apparently lit a fire. No one was really watching the place. Criminal negligence. The whole thing burned down. One on the photograph that Prokudin-Gorsky photographed it on the left. One of the greatest wooden churches in Russia. It just burned down. Somebody lit a fire to keep warm during the winter and it burned down. Then certain people in St. Petersburg said, well, we'll recreate it. We'll rebuild it. But don't let's put it out there. Let's put it next to St. Petersburg so more people can enjoy it. And there they recreated it at a park to the south of Petersburg, right on the Neva River, where the cruise ships go by. So if you're taking the cruise, you'll see the church that burned down in 1960. I talk about this in my text. And at the same time, you'll see the recreation without the white plank siding. It was added there in the 19th century. You'll see its recreation. Again,
it's a beautiful building. Was it recreated to scale?
Yes, yes.
That's amazing.
Yes, absolutely to scale. There were some controversial features as usual, but I won't get into that. Anyway, so now this is the photograph that really stimulates so many thoughts if we keep in mind the fact that these photographs, his and mine, are bookends to the long 20th century. This is on a levee at Belozersk. Behind is the Church of St. Paraskeva. Belozersk is a town, very ancient town, one of the most ancient in Russia, on White Lake, Belaya Ozero, in the Russian north. And again, the cruise ships coming from Petersburg to Moscow come through this lake. All right, there are the children there. In the afternoon sun, they're sort of sitting there, behaving themselves, squinting into the sun. It's just a lovely photograph. Look at the little infant there over on the left. She is naughty. She doesn't stay still. She turns her head. And remember, Prokudin-Gorsky's negative is being exposed 3 times, right? Chunk, chunk, chunk. It drops down. We had a view of that negative. Somehow we sort of lost it, but never mind. Let's not look for it. But anyway, you see how her head is blue, yellow, and red? That's why because she turned her head as the photograph, the negative, was dropping down into the camera for those 3 exposures, each one with a different filter. There you have the color separation right there in her head. You see it over on the left? You might want to point if you can, the arrow over there. Yeah, right there. You see her head? Here. That is the 3, because she moved her head slowly as the negative was dropping down 3 times, 3 exposures. You can see the emulsion lines on the borders of the photograph there. Red, yellow, and cyan or blue. She turned her head so that motion is recorded and frozen during the process of his taking the photograph. At the beginning of my book, I show what that glass negative looked like. And I'm not sure why it didn't turn up on the screen here, but anyway, it was a long horizontal glass plate. It had to drop down before the lens 3 times to record the 3 basic colors that would be recombined for a color image. And as each one of them required a second exposure, you can see her head moving. That's why she seems to have that sort of tutti frutti color head at the top. The other children were told to stay still. They were old enough to obey, and their faces are a result of the Prokudin-Gorsky photo. There's my photograph over on the right. But when I look at those children, I wonder what happened to them. His photograph was taken in 1911, I believe. And in the next decade, Masha, their future was not bright. War, revolution, famine, violence on a massive scale. One wonders what happened to those children.
Yeah, you know, my mother's family comes from around this area roughly. And I don't know, my grandmother or my grand aunt could be one of these children.
Sure.
As I'm looking at them. And I know that there was, they are looking into a life full of trials and tribulations and hardship.
That's right.
In the 20th century.
That's right.
William, I could just look at every single picture in your book. Your stories are so fascinating, but I think it's time to probably answer some questions.
Okay.
Because I see we have some questions here, and I'll
You can advance the photographs as we are answering the questions.
Michelle, could you help us navigate the Q&A session?
Sure. And I know that we're scheduled to be done at 8, but we're just going to stay on. And this is a fascinating discussion. So if you do need to depart, this whole thing is going to be recorded and posted onto our website as well. So,
and the book is available in the bookstore, so that everything that I'm talking about is in the book, which I think Masha will tell you, it just draws you in. You just open it anywhere and just start looking and start reading.
We've had people comment that there are people in this audience that have the book and think it's absolutely spectacular. Masha, can you hold up? It's quite a large book.
Yeah.
It's huge. Of course, your background is making it invisible. It's a beautiful book.
Yeah. Wow. You can't see it actually.
I have an interesting question come up here.
The sponsors.
There it is.
Oh, yes.
I have to go way back in order to get it. It weighs over 6 pounds.
Yeah.
Okay. Yes. Questions.
Let's talk about the process of choosing the 400 photos that you put in this book. Can you tell us a little bit how you went about that?
Yeah. Excellent. Yeah. I decided to group them into 8 journeys, which are basically geographically determined. These are journeys that I compose as a writer. They are composites of various trips that he took and I took. But they fall into geographical regions, and each one of those journeys has a map at the beginning, so you know where you are. So that we might go into the ancient area, the heartland of Vladimir and Rostov and so forth to the northeast of Moscow. And then the second journey would be in the west, which brings us toward Moscow. He didn't photograph Moscow or Petersburg, not in this collection. He wanted to do guidebooks, and so he took some images, but they're not a part of the Prokudin-Gorsky collection. Rather, his impulse was to bring the Russian Empire to the major cities and show what the Russian Empire actually represented. He believed in that empire, just as it was on the brink of cataclysm. So I try to reproduce that so people will have an idea of the path. That made much more sense to me than trying to come up with some sort of chronological division. Make it a sense of exploration. So that accounts for the core of the book. At the beginning of the book, I talk about my work at the National Gallery of Art and the Prokudin-Gorsky collection at the Library of Congress. I give some technical information. I give some biographical information. But the core of the book are those 8 journeys, which include number 7, which goes to Central Asia, Samarkand and Bukhara. And then the final one was the last trip that he took in the grim year of 1916, when so much was going wrong on the battlefield. And Prokudin-Gorsky was photographing a railroad north to Murmansk so that the Allies could deliver war material to their hard-pressed Russian comrades. And that leads to the wonderful photograph that you chose for the introduction, the Solovetsky Monastery, and so forth and so on. So that is the principle, the basic principle of the book, a series of journeys.
Wonderful. I have a lot of questions about Prokudin-Gorsky, which I think what a fascinating figure. And I can't blame you for following in these footsteps and following this journey along with them. I did get an interesting question about whether Prokudin-Gorsky took any photos of migrants or migration routes to Siberia or Turkestan.
He took photographs of settlers, Russian settlers, who were coming into this area. And there too was a very combustible point, because he didn't record this, but many of the local peoples, they resented this incursion. Okay? Sounds familiar story, right?
Mm-hmm.
So he certainly took pictures of Russian settlers because he saw them as bringers of progress. They were going to make the land fertile and productive, but as we know, that's not necessarily the way other people are going to view it, particularly if it's your land that the settlers are settling on, right? So there's a lot of historical information to be gleaned from those photographs, but they're really, I wouldn't so much call them migrants as Russian settlers coming into other non-Russian cultures. And he would sometimes photograph very sensitively the people who lived in those areas. The Uzbeks, for example, the Tajiks, the Kyrgyz, he would photograph them all. But soon, Michelle, that entire region would explode in a fury of violence.
Mm-hmm. Now, going to your journey in your time photographing, did you need any special permissions or anything to take photos or to get any of your gear, anything back and forth on your trips?
Yes, you had to let people know what you were doing.
Mm-hmm.
And there were all sorts of technical details that I could give in that respect. I don't know how much your audience is interested in that. For a while, I had privileges with the embassy pouch, the U.S. Embassy, and that was a huge favor granted me, so I could get my film out and get it developed. There were all sorts of technical details there. It became easier after Gorbachev came during the 1980s. Things began to open up, and you could travel more freely, and you could get the film in and out. But yeah, it was not simple.
We're glad that you made that journey and we're glad that you did that. I have one more question for you. I have an interesting question about your experience in photographing Russia. What places in Russia do you never get tired of photographing?
You know, I am an adventurer there. I always will take, and invitations come up out of the blue. Someone will say, well, come to our city or come to this and come to that. You said, if you arrange it, I'll do it. And I just make wonderful discoveries. And there are places I go back to. People invite me. I haven't been back for 15 years. And the discovery, in the first case, I have different cameras now than the cameras I used to use. I used to work on film. Now I work on digital. If I'm going to a place that has a lot of frescoes, I want to reshoot those because digital imagery brings out detail that maybe the film didn't. So that I'm always willing to go to any of these places. There's a while when I focused on the Russian North, particularly since 1998 and say 2015. But it's just a matter of being open to the experience, and that's how it all began for me anyway. You invite me, I'll go.
Well, we're really happy that you could take the time to speak to our audience. We always enjoy working with you, and it's been such a pleasure. And I only wish that we could be in the same room and having you speak to people in the gallery, but hopefully down the road.
And I can sign all of the copies of the book when that does happen.
Absolutely. I realized I popped on the video and you may not know who I am. My name is Michelle Massey. I'm the Director of Public Programs here at the museum. And on behalf of all of us, I would like to thank both Masha and William for this wonderful program tonight. Again, the book is available at the shop at the museum. You'll see the museum right behind me. We'd love to have you. You can simply stop by. We're taking all the precautions. It's a very safe and wonderful place to come visit. If you are not local and you'd like a copy of the book, we'd be happy to take care of that. You can contact us at info@TMORA.org, and I'll type that again into the chat box, and we can hook you up with all the arrangements for getting a copy of the book.
And anybody who has questions, feel free to write me, william.brumfield@gmail. I welcome the questions if you have questions we didn't get to this evening.
Absolutely. And with that, thank you everyone for joining us. It's been a pleasure seeing you, and we hope to see you in the galleries soon. William?
Yes.
You're amazing. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you,
Thank you,
Masha.
William.
Good night, everybody.
Stay well. Stay well.